There is a statistic in America that most people hear but almost nobody truly understands. And that statistic is that nearly 70% of divorces are initiated by women. And the moment this number is mentioned, the conversation usually collapses into defensiveness, anger, or blame because people assume it is an accusation rather than a signal. But this number is not about women hating marriage or men failing as husbands. It is about something far more uncomfortable, something quieter, and far more revealing about how modern relationships actually fall apart. Because divorce is never the beginning of the story. It is the final sentence of a much longer one that most people stop reading too early. At first glance, this statistic feels shocking, especially to men who believed their marriages were stable, functional, or at least not that bad. And this is where the first misunderstanding appears, because many men experience divorce as a sudden event, while many women experience it as the end of a process that started years earlier. And this difference in timing creates the illusion that women leave out of nowhere, when in reality they often leave only after they have emotionally exhausted every internal option they believed they had, long before legal paperwork ever enters the picture. The question most people should be asking is not why women initiate divorce more often, but why men are so often surprised when it happens. Because surprise is rarely a sign of innocence. It is usually a sign of emotional unawareness. And in modern marriages, emotional awareness has become just as important as financial stability, loyalty, or presence, even though many men were never taught to see relationships through that lens. For decades, men were raised with a simple equation: provide, protect, stay loyal, and the marriage will survive. And in earlier generations, that equation worked because marriage itself was built around survival rather than fulfillment. But modern marriage operates under a completely different contract, one that was never clearly explained, where emotional connection, communication, validation, and psychological safety are no longer optional extras, but core expectations. And when those expectations are not met, dissatisfaction does not explode immediately. It settles in quietly and begins reshaping the relationship from the inside. Most divorces are not triggered by one dramatic event. They are triggered by accumulation, by conversations that were avoided, emotions that were minimized, and needs that were labeled as overreactions. And this is where many men unknowingly fall behind, because while they are focused on maintaining stability, many women are tracking emotional distance, and the gap between those two perspectives grows slowly enough that it feels invisible until it becomes irreversible. When people hear different numbers quoted online, this is where confusion often starts, because depending on the data set, the time period, and whether the study looks at the general population or specific groups like college-educated couples, the figures do vary, and most serious research places the range between roughly 65% to over 75% of divorces being initiated by women, depending on the study. But regardless of the exact number, the pattern itself has remained remarkably consistent for decades, which tells us this is not a coincidence. It is a structural trend. One of the most overlooked factors behind divorce initiation is emotional labor. Not the kind that shows up in arguments, but the kind that shows up in awareness, in remembering, in anticipating emotional shifts, and in maintaining relational balance. And research consistently shows that women carry a disproportionate share of this labor in marriages, often without recognition. And when emotional labor becomes one-sided, the relationship may continue structurally, but emotionally, it begins to hollow out. And people rarely leave relationships because of what is missing materially. They leave because of what is missing emotionally. This is why the statistic rises even higher among educated women, because education tends to sharpen self-awareness and expectation alignment. And when a woman becomes aware that her emotional needs are consistently unmet, staying no longer feels like patience. It feels like self-erasure. And once that internal realization sets in, the marriage is already in its final chapter, even if both partners are still sharing the same home. Men often misinterpret this process because emotional withdrawal does not look like conflict. It looks like calm, reduced demands, fewer arguments, and less emotional intensity, which feels like improvement rather than danger. But emotional withdrawal is not peace. It is preparation. And by the time a woman stops arguing, she has usually stopped believing that arguing will change anything, which is why divorce feels sudden to men but overdue to women. comfortable truth is that women are more likely to seek clarity before they seek exit, through friends, therapy, or introspection, while men are more likely to delay, suppress, or avoid emotional confrontation. And this difference alone explains much of the initiation gap, because the person who reaches clarity first is usually the person who takes action first, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion from waiting for change that never arrived. Financial independence has amplified this pattern, not by destroying marriage, but by removing necessity as a reason to stay. And when staying is no longer required for survival, it must be justified by fulfillment. And this shift has exposed weaknesses that were always present but previously hidden under dependency, tradition, or social pressure. And this does not make modern women disloyal. It makes modern marriage more honest, and honesty is often painful before it is liberating. The cultural narrative surrounding personal fulfillment has also reshaped divorce dynamics, especially for women, because modern culture frames emotional dissatisfaction not as a phase to endure, but as a signal to act. And when dissatisfaction is validated socially rather than stigmatized, leaving becomes psychologically coherent rather than shameful. While men, who are often socialized to equate endurance with virtue, may remain in emotionally unfulfilling marriages far longer, hoping stability will eventually repair what attention never addressed. This mismatch creates a tragic dynamic where neither side feels understood. Men feel blindsided and punished, women feel unheard and dismissed, and the legal act of divorce becomes a battlefield for emotional failures that were never properly named, let alone resolved. And this is why the statistic itself should not be read as evidence of hostility, but as evidence of asymmetry in emotional awareness and action. What makes this dynamic even more painful is that many men genuinely believe they were doing their best, and in many cases they were. But effort without alignment still leads to failure, and love without understanding still collapses under pressure, because relationships do not end when people stop caring. They end when people stop feeling seen. The irony is that most women who initiate divorce did not want to leave when the problems first appeared. They wanted change, engagement, and emotional responsiveness. But when repeated attempts to communicate are met with minimization or avoidance, hope erodes, and once hope disappears, commitment follows shortly after. Not because commitment was weak, but because it was unsupported. This statistic also exposes a deeper issue within modern masculinity, where men are rarely taught how to lead emotionally without controlling, how to listen without fixing, and how to remain present without withdrawing. And without these skills, many men unknowingly allow emotional distance to grow until it feels normal, and by the time it becomes visible, the emotional bridge has already collapsed. Nearly 70% of divorces being initiated by women is not a condemnation of women. It is a mirror held up to modern relationships, reflecting a gap between expectation and preparation, between emotional demand and emotional skill, and until that gap is addressed, the statistic will remain stable, regardless of how loudly people argue about blame. Divorce, in most cases, is not a failure of love, but a failure of understanding. And the reason women initiate divorce more often is not because they value commitment less, but because they are more likely to recognize when a relationship has stopped functioning at its core. And once that recognition becomes clear, action becomes inevitable. This is not a call to fear marriage, nor a reason to resent women. It is a call to awareness, because understanding these patterns is the only way to interrupt them, and ignoring them does not preserve relationships. It only delays their collapse. And the quiet truth beneath this statistic is not that marriage is broken, but that emotional literacy has not kept pace with modern expectations. Nearly 70% is not just a number, it is a warning. And like all warnings, it only helps those willing to listen before it becomes personal. This is Mendecoded, where we don't hate women, we don't shame men, and we don't sugarcoat truth. We decode it. And if you made it this far, I want to hear from you. Do you think respect between men and women can be rebuilt in America? Or is it already gone for good? Drop your thoughts below, not to argue, not to attack, but to understand. Because maybe the real revolution isn't about power at all. Maybe it's about bringing back respect.